So my name is Erica Brown, and I'll be the moderator for today's panel discussion on inclusion. I am a community network builder. I work with Neighborhood Connections. We are an affiliate program of the Cleveland Foundation, and in my work at Neighborhood Connections, I work specifically in the Glenville neighborhood, and I also support the Neighbor Up Network. And the Neighbor Up Network is made up of 1,200 card-carrying members of civic leaders, grassroots leaders from all around the city and various other places who are committed to creating an extraordinary world right where we live, and they are committed to taking action to create that world that they envision. So I'm going to introduce our panelists right now. I'm going to introduce each one of them individually and then let them tell you about themselves. So first panelist, reproductive justice advocate Maria Miranda, who is in the documentary The Fixers that we'll be speaking about later. Schiller, Director of Research at Policy Matters, Ohio. Artist Kate Sopko, who's a producer on the documentary project The Fixers. Writer Sage Mack, who is a recent graduate of the Cleveland School of the Arts, class of 2016, and she'll be attending Cleveland State University this fall. And also Daniel Gray-Kontar, who's the Executive Artistic Director of 12 Literary and Performing Arts Incubator. Thank you for all being here today.
Thank you.
So I'm actually going to just let each panelist go down the line, tell a little bit more about yourself and what brings you here today.
So as she said, my name is Maria Miranda. I am a lifelong Clevelander, give and take a few years. I am working with Kate on the project The Fixers. I've done different artistic endeavors in Cleveland, mostly centered around feminist work, women of color, reproductive justice, abortion, sexual assault, justice advocacy work. So that's really my central focus is women, 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 and how we can make our lives better globally.
I'm research director, as she said, for Policy Matters Ohio, which we're based over at 36th and Perkins, and we're a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institute, and we do research that is about Ohio's workers, but about Ohio's low and middle income people with the idea of trying to advance policy that's going to improve the lives of those folks. And so my own interests as a researcher, I've done a lot of work on the state budget, on the state tax system, which is unfortunately heading very much in the wrong direction, and more recently on other issues like unemployment insurance and other vital programs.
My name is Kate Sopko. I'm the lead artist on a project called The Fixers. It's been a large-scale collaborative film project that I guess hundreds of us have been working on over the past year. And what we did is track down and follow a series of Clevelanders whose work is invested in social equity across the city and ask them what tour of the city they would give RNC delegates if they had the chance. And those turned into 6 films that we've been releasing serially since May 20th. They're all out now, and it was a pleasure to work with Maria on the last one.
My name is Sage Mack. I'm a graduating senior and I'm also an intern at 12. And as an artist, I try to testify, exchange global messages to the conditions of our community.
My name is Daniel Gray-Kontar, and I'm a poet, journalist, educator, and a youth mentor. And I'm also the founder of an organization called 12 Literary and Performative Arts Incubator. And at 12, what we do is work specifically with youth to develop their voice, whether that be in performance poetry or playwriting or fiction. We also work with adults, and we bring them together intergenerationally, and we create literary works with a social justice bent in particular. We've been around for just a few months, and we're excited to be here and to help develop youth that will share a voice in Cleveland.
Thank you, everyone. I'm going to dive right into the questions. That's what we're here for, so we can get some discussion going. The first question I'm going to ask, and I'm going to give everyone an opportunity to answer the first question themselves. We're talking about inclusion. We're talking about the Cleveland Renaissance. So the first thing we want to do is define what is the Cleveland Renaissance. How do you see it? How do you define it? And you can take it from there. So we'll start with you, Maria.
So I think that, from my perspective, I mean, we could talk about the Renaissance in a lot of ways. We could talk about developing neighborhoods. We can talk about, there's a new restaurant opening every week. Those are the good things. For me, I think that the Renaissance is an awakening around justice, and for Cleveland to once again be one of the hubs of a movement, especially around Black people specifically, and how we are responding to oppressive measures that are happening. So when I talk to people, elders in the community that remember like the Huff riots, some will say that it doesn't feel much different, now than it did then. So I think that for me, the Renaissance is that we are finding people that are getting more involved in making their cities safer again in a just region.
Thank you.
I guess I have a certain issue with the idea that we're undergoing a real renaissance. It seems like we do that every 15, 20 years, which is much more frequently than certainly the real renaissance that we experienced. I guess the question I would ask rather is renaissance for whom? And no doubt we are seeing some important revitalization in certain areas, but my view is that it is exclusive and in fact leaves out the bulk of the residents of our community. And this can be captured in any number of statistics where in fact I think that unfortunately what we've seen in Cleveland and even in the larger county and metro area is an increase in all of the indicators of neglect and social ills, and be it poverty line, the number of people receiving different kinds of benefits, as much as those are crucial and viable. I don't see that our new public square, as much as I like to, get my feet wet in the new fountain, I wonder about whether, in fact, that's an appropriate investment compared to all of the ways in which we're underinvesting in our community.
Okay.
Yeah, for me, it's kind of heartening for me to hear you say your definition of the Renaissance, because like when I hear the word Cleveland Renaissance, it doesn't mean much of value to me. Like I feel like it's it shows a limited imagination around what neighborhood improvement looks like. I think, and it's usually about commercially driven improvements. Redeveloping an area, bringing in high-end businesses, pricing people out of a community. And so I'm really interested in seeing like how we can develop different visions of what it looks like to like rebuild lost social fabric in neighborhoods and like really build off of the cultural threads that we have across this community that are super strong, but we don't point to as our assets.
Just to piggyback on what you guys said, it's really like the Renaissance going on, the building, the creation, but who's involved in that and gets the benefit from this Renaissance, like communities that are being gentrified, and who gets to stay in those communities. Like they were before, they gentrified, who's there now? And it's like neighborhoods on the west side, like Tremont, I heard it wasn't all that nice before, but people who moved in are wealthier. The inclusion of people who get to participate in the Renaissance.
So I do not think that you can really think about a Cleveland Renaissance without thinking about the state of young people. And so for me, I have to define a Cleveland Renaissance as an authentic investment in young people and a truly authentic ear to the point of departure of young people, where they're coming from, what their perception is of how this city and how their municipalities should be shaped, and how we include their voice in thinking about how a true reawakening in the city of Cleveland can occur. I don't see a whole heck of a lot of that type of inclusion happening. And so from that standpoint, I have to question if Renaissance is the true word that we need to use.
Okay. So we're going to go there next. So what I'm hearing is that it's Cleveland Renaissance. Those are awesome words, but what does it actually mean? And clearly it's not meaning the same thing for all residents of Cleveland. So who's being excluded? If this is a conversation about inclusion in the Cleveland Renaissance, then who is it for, and who doesn't seem that it's for at all? Who's being excluded from this? And since everyone comes from a unique perspective, I would appreciate, really, I'm sure the audience would appreciate too, if you speak to, where you really see that people are being excluded from the rebirth, from the revitalization, from the development. Anyone can jump in.
All right. So I think that in Cleveland we have a real opportunity for transformation, and I'll just lock into what's been on a lot of people's minds, and that is police reform. And I think that we have a rare opportunity to invite and engage the people who perhaps engage with police the most, and that is youth. And I found that they have rarely been asked to come to the table when it comes to thinking about who should our next police commissioner be? What should be the policies that make sense as young people in particular engage with police? How can young people actually be brought to the table so that they can be a part of the transformation of the police department and what it could and should look like so that it's truly a reawakening? And that rarely ever happens. So young people are very often excluded, and even though in many instances, when I seek to bring young people to the table, they bring ideas that I never would have thought of, because this is their social entelechy that they live in. It's not mine, it's theirs. So they can relate to it in ways that I certainly cannot. So it is important for me to hear their voices so that I can begin to inspire and make change in concert with them. And I just feel as though that's something that needs to happen more, so that they are included in the shaping of policy in the moment, but also moving forward.
Thank you.
Well, I would say that low-income Clevelanders have largely been excluded from this. And I think a perfect example of this is what's happened recently with our public transit. We heard that the Republican National Convention that helped bring about this event came to Cleveland in part because of our great public transit system. That's at least what we were told. What have we seen in the past few months? We've had countless hearings at which any number of people have said we cannot afford to have further reductions in a transit system that is already inadequate. And instead, what we have had is reductions in service and an increase in fares for people who are least able to have that take place. At the same time, what do we see around us right now? We see free trolleys that are here for the use of the conventioneers, paid for by private sources. Now, I don't want to begrudge the conventioneers. I'm glad that they have some way to get around, and they aren't all driving their own cars. But I think, to me, this reminds me of a term, I think it was used 50 or more years ago about, what was it, private wealth and public squalor. And I think that this is still what we're experiencing now. We need a strong public transit system, and not just for poor people, actually. I mean, it's more and well known that this is something that's useful in cities across the country to help cities revitalize themselves. Instead, we have policy that means that we're seeing cutbacks in our public transit system. And I think that underlines one other element here that we shouldn't forget, which is that the conditions that we're talking about here are very much influenced and driven by actual policy. It isn't just, something that falls from heaven, what we're experiencing. It's a result of our own decisions, or the people who we elect and their decisions, or private corporations and their decisions. And we have an opportunity to influence those decisions, and we need to do so.
Okay.
To piggyback off of that a little bit, I think a lot of what I'm seeing, I would kind of turn the question around. It's let's think about what it would look like if every time we had a decision to make about how money was going to be spent, how design was going to work in our communities, all these big infrastructural questions, that the people who are most affected by how the decision was going to roll would be the ones driving the decision making and the design work. And you're it so rarely ever happens that we see it that way, that it's so many people are excluded. It's actually a huge amount of people that are excluded. We did one of the Fixers films on transit in particular, and the woman who kind of led led the tour on that. She lives at East 79th and Woodland, and it's right where the East 79th Street red line stops, and the station's in deplorable condition. And actually, for a while, it was unclear whether it was going to be shut down or not. She's a really active organizer, and didn't even know, found out during the shoot that actually money had been put into it, and it was in tandem with the development of the Opportunity Corridor project. And it's a really great example. She basically said over and over during the course of the shoot, where we were talking to riders in her neighborhood about how you can't catch a bus after 8 o'clock, and how you're so dramatically underserved right next to this $300 million project that we got handed down to us. And she was like, this should not be a tale of two cities. She described it. I'm living in a totally different city than somebody who's on the 55 line on Clinton. And I think we can describe so many of our infrastructural stories in Cleveland in that exact way. And that is because people's voices are not being included in the process.
Well, I think a lot of the Renaissance is about people who get the opportunity to speak. A lot of people poor or people in disadvantaged neighborhoods like Glenville, coming from Glenville, they don't get affected by, I don't see them getting affected by the Renaissance at all. It's still in bad condition. Like you said, people coming from these neighborhoods don't have the chance. When you're thinking about paying rent, how are you gonna think about the policies that are coming to downtown? So it's you don't even get the opportunity to think about what can happen when you're trying to worry about bills and feeding your children.
Maria? So 5 of the 6 films in the Fixers series feature Black women, and that was not by design. It was it was reflecting a reality that Black women drive a lot of what's changing. We also carry a lot of what's happening on our backs, and we have for a long time. I think it speaks to the reality that when women are uplifted, whole communities are uplifted. When women are oppressed, whole communities are oppressed. How we treat women is a signal of how we are doing as a society. And Ohio is a very hostile climate for women in terms of pay, in terms of leave, paid maternity leave if you work, if you're lucky to have a job that offers that, in terms of reproductive health and access, obviously. When we talk about access to birth control, when we talk about access to comprehensive, accurate sexual education in schools, when we talk about abortion, we are one of the worst states. NARAL gave Ohio an F in terms of how well women can access things that they need. And it's obvious to me, if it's not to you, that when a woman controls her fertility, is able to control her sexuality, she's able to do things like go to work, go to college, own a business, whatever that might look like. And so when you have so in my film that I work on with Kate, we look at the high rate of infant mortality in Northeast Ohio, particularly Cleveland, and it does impact Black women disproportionately. So Cleveland has the highest infant mortality rate in the state, and Ohio has one of the highest rates in the nation. So there are developing countries with better infant mortality rates than here. And so when you have a high likelihood of babies dying from things that are highly preventable, that tells you that there's something wrong with how we handle our people. And you have these rates happening in communities that are minutes away from one of the premier hospital institutions in the nation. And so that's really concerning and bothersome, and quite frankly infuriating, that Black babies continue to die at a rate that is disproportionate even to white babies born to poor. So you could be a Black woman with a PhD and still have a higher likelihood of losing your child than a white woman who has a GED or lower. So what you have, to Zach's point, is some policy changes that have created this environment, something that's wholly systemic. But when we talk about any change, whether it's the schools, whether it's police reform, whether it's health and environment, food, access, you're talking really about the moms, grandmothers, and the women. I work with young women a lot, and their concern is not just whether or not they go to school, but it's like, am I going to be sexually assaulted when I get to college? Am I going to be able to prevent pregnancy? Am I going to be shamed for the choices that I make? And so that is a lot of burden to carry on top of just trying to figure out what to do with your life. So to your point, if you're thinking about where's my next meal coming from, or am I going to be safe, it's really hard to think about, can I go to the next public transit meeting, or can I make a decision about who to vote for, where to find that information. So I think especially with what's going on this week, there are, black women are definitely not on the RNC agenda, but they're really not when they're not here. So I think that when we center women, and really this goes beyond race, when we center women completely in any situation, we are really doing better for the whole if we do that.
So if I could chime in, so I think one of the things that I'm hearing, and one of the things that I know I've come across in working with a number of parents, is this question of how do we engage in the proper process for including people, right? What does that actually look like? How do we get folks to be included in the discussion that are so busy raising children and so busy? You're about to ask.
You're good.
Okay, you're about to.
Fine.
Okay.
So I'm going to go right to you because that is the next question. So we have, what I'm hearing is, and from my own work, the majority of Clevelanders are not included in this process. So we have this great thing that says it's the Cleveland Renaissance. We see the cranes, we see the development, we hear the things that are happening, but the majority of Clevelanders that we know, that we come in contact with, that we see all the time, are not being included. How are we going to get them to the table? So part of what my work is what we're fond of saying is we like to level the playing field. How do we get that inclusion? How do we get people to the table? Because yes, if you're worried about the basics, the next community meeting is not really on your agenda. So how do we get to that point? And I would love to hear from everybody their ideas about how to get that inclusive thing that we need to get going here. And I especially want to hear from Sage.
I think the first step would have people feel like they can have a voice and feel like their voice matters, because I think a lot of times what happens is, oh, I'm not going to speak because why would anybody want to listen to me? And the first step is to make you feel like we want to hear from you, because a lot of times youth doesn't get that. It's always oh no, not right now. It's not really your place right now. It's inappropriate. And black women need to feel like they matter. We need to feel like we have a say, because we are pretty much the backbone of the black community. We need to feel like, oh, you have something to say. We need to hear what you're saying. So I think that's the first step.
You took the words right out of my mouth. I'll add a little bit more. I think educators have a real role in bringing people together, and I think that a lot of times what we don't have an opportunity to do is bring parents together in the same room, so that all parents realize that it's not just my child, but it's all of the children that are in this class, or all the children that are in this school. So if we can do a better job of pulling the parents together in the same space and really beginning to engage parents in the process of developing their youth in concert with us, that's a great first step. So I think that schools are a great first place where community, we all have a stake in our children coming together in schooling institutions. So if schools can do a better job of bringing them together in the same space, that's a great launching pad.
Yeah, I mean, I have sort of two answers, and the first one is I'm very glad to be asked that question, but I think it's really important for us to realize that in terms of how public processes work, they don't tend to focus on that at all. And if it's done, it's usually in a really superficial way, oh, we're doing a public design project, we need to do this community meeting. Usually the decision's already made. People know that. They've been to these meetings. They've been a part of doing, saying something that was important to them and hearing it not go anywhere. And so I think there's a profound amount of distrust, and it's well earned in how institutions interact with communities. And in my mind, it's if radical inclusion is not a part of democratic process, it's just a failing process. So the other side of it is, I feel off of what Daniel was describing, it was really amazing to encounter wraparound schools, which is a pilot program in its third year that United Way has been supporting, and 25 schools in the CMSD right now are doing this, and it's basically really intensive social service provision within the schools themselves, and a lot of creative partnerships with local institutions about how you respond to the fact that what poverty brings to the table in a struggling school is a whole bunch of obstacles that a kid or a family could be facing for a kid connecting with an educational experience. And you never know how it is in a particular family. And so having somebody on site who's really responding to what's being seen. If that's that a kid is not eating enough food over the course of a weekend, it's making sure that they're going home with something to eat for the weekend. Or, you know, if kids aren't making it to school because there's concern about them getting there safely, they've developed this program called the walking school bus, which is just like a parent will just know that at this specific time a volunteer will be at this specific intersection, and they can drop their kid off there and they walk together to the school. And you're like, some of these are such easy solutions. They're just like community-based gestures, and it's plugging into how people's lives are already going. And I think that's where you get the most effective inclusion is when like, well, what do we actually need here, and can we make a community level response?
If I can just add one other thing about that, I think that one thing that makes us feel included is that we're showing in multiple ways that we're truly interested in where you come from. And I think part of that is something very simple, which is arranging the space and wherever the community engagement is happening. And just making sure that that space comes from the same social and cultural entelechy that the folk come from. So a lot of times we enter a space and it feels very foreign to us, right? But by making the space feel comfortable to community, by arranging the space in such a way so that it doesn't feel like there's some hierarchy between us and them, so that there's the creation of some authentic kind of listening and authentic learning and interplay, instead of a, we're here listening to you, give us your thoughts, we will compute your thoughts and shoot them back to you once we have heard them. But really creating community within the context of the space. That allows people to feel comfortable, it allows them to feel like they can share, and it allows them to feel like they're being heard. So even really very simple stuff within the context of institutions like schools or wherever the engagement happens goes a very long way.
I think the question, I like to think of myself as like, you know, if anyone watches The Golden Girls, I'm like Sophia Petrillo. I'm like this old lady on the inside that feels like she's seen so much because I'm tired. And so I am done talking about inclusivity because the reality is that the powers that be have no desire to be inclusive. So when we are like, how can we make this more inclusive? It's like, you know, they don't want to be inclusive. So I can tell you to hold your meetings at a time that's convenient to working people. I can tell you to provide childcare. I could tell you to have things where it's on a bus line or safe or whatever. I could do all that. There is no desire to be inclusive because when you become inclusive, you're going to hear what you don't want to hear. You're going to have your power disrupted. So why would I want to do that if I'm up here? I don't. If people were asked about public square, they probably would have said, why are we rebuilding public square? Let's do something else. And that was not what they wanted to do. The decisions have already been made. I now advocate and believe in a complete dismantling of the institutions that exist. I don't want to level the playing field. I want to decimate the existing playing field. I want to burn down the table at which you sit because I don't want to sit at your table anymore because your table sucks. And so, sorry, I'm not very articulate, but the reality is that that is still trying to meet them where they are. And they do not want that. In a society where women, and especially Black people, especially at a time now where they really don't care whether we live or die, I can't fathom trying to communicate with you about something that you don't truly believe in, which is my sheer humanity. So I can't tell you how to be more inclusive because the whole thing has to be torn down. So in other words, a complete and total revolution.
Well, I don't really disagree with what you have to say, but
but realistically,
I
of
think
course.
there's something. What I was going to try and add here, because I don't feel like I think a lot has been said that's very useful on this, but I think that we should try and learn a little bit from Cleveland's own history, and we are not going to succeed by negotiating with people. We're going to succeed through collective action, and this is what's been proven in our own history. And I would go back. I've long thought that this ought to be taught at every Cleveland public school. We had in our community a group called the Future Outlook League in the 1930s, which was one of the most effective organizations in the country in organizing so that Black people could work at the places where they shopped, and basically organizing on an economic basis in what was certainly an even more a time that was, if we talk now about people not being able as individuals to find the time or the resources to participate in civic life, you certainly can't say that in the ultra-segregated Jim Crow 1930s during the Great Depression that people were somehow more able then. They were obviously less able, and yet somehow they managed to form an organization that was impressive beyond belief in organizing for their economic and social rights. And that wasn't just then. It happened, into the 1950s and 60s with our civil rights movement here. And so I don't know how one gets that history imparted to people, but I think that it shows that we can be successful collectively. And we have been in the past, and we can be in the future. And so there's a certain element of inspiration here that I think people need, that I realize they're not going to go back and all read that book about it, but it's one other possible element in that equation.
Okay, so let's go there next. I have my questions, but I'm going into this next question. Let's talk about collective action. So we know what it sounds like. We know how we feel about it. We know that it needs to happen. You talked about the dismantling and doing something totally different. In my mind, I'm listening to that and I hear now that's a reawakening, that's a rebirth, that's a renaissance. How do we do that? How do we play that role in each? I mean, you can only answer for yourselves and how you see your role in that, but how do you see your role in that collective action, in that dismantling and rebuilding and the rebirth of what can be a great Cleveland?
I think the kitchen table is a place where a movement has been born. And I think for myself, I find myself more and more being a convener, especially when we have young women. That's when you're just graduating from high school. See, I'm an old lady compared to Sage, but I feel good because I'm like, okay, she can carry this. Just like there's women, my foremothers, who tell me I can carry for them. Mentorship, relationships. I have women in my life that I can count on to teach me history, to listen when I need to be heard, to tell me that my experiences are normal and valid. So for me, looking back at the consciousness raising movements that feminists did back in the day, it still holds water to today in terms of people coming together and talking first about their experiences, because the dominant culture will make you think you're crazy. They will make you think that the thing that happened to you or what you saw was a one-off thing and it won't happen again, or it didn't really happen the way you said it did. So validating experiences is really, really important, especially for women. When women tell their stories, they're often stigmatized, they're shamed, or told that they're told that they don't believe, they're not being believed. So for me, that's what I do, is I center women, I listen to them, I help to validate their experiences, because that's really the first step in hearing yourself and developing that awareness, is that I'm not crazy. This really is how things are happening. I think then from there, your collective action starts. That's when those movements start. So when people go, you know what, I am earning less money now that I realize it, me too. I also could not get access to that store. Me neither. And so when you start to do those things on a very individual micro level, you start to get the whispers of a shout. And that's my experience.
Take turns. And I think it's important that we build little communities where people's voices are respected completely. People whose voices often aren't respected, Black women, homeless people, just building little communities, not at this large scale, everybody from all these outer greater Cleveland comes to this one place, but little communities, like the village gets to raise a child, coming together, little.
Anyone else want to speak to collective action?
Yeah, I think it's really important that people who've gotten used to taking up a lot of space start acting as conveners who want to hear the design intelligence of people who are living, the daily experience in the city. And if they won't do that, then we have to do that. Demand that space, really develop best practices around how you convene those spaces. I think it's really important. I think writing news stories right now is really important. I've been a part of activist communities and organizers in this city for a long time, and I just feel like we've gotten so used to failing that we don't even try anymore. And we specifically don't try to build really strong relationships across a tremendous social and residential segregation that really determines how we live across the city. And so I think it's time to just turn it on its head.
So collective action. So I think that one of the things that has been, Sage brought up our classroom on 201, and I always have to go back to the classroom, and I always have to remind my students and their parents that education is one thing and schooling is something entirely different. And I think that with my students, for them, their education starts first and foremost with a profound interrogation of self, understanding who I am and why do I do the things that I do, and continuing to engage in that process so that you are educating yourself. And when you're able to do that, you're able to answer a very, very simple question. And I have to start with youth. You answer a very simple question, and that question is, what am I good at? And when you're able to answer that question, that sends you on a trajectory for your own education and for your own growth and development that when nurtured by adults and other peers, you begin to understand your lane. And when you understand your lane, I think that you begin to not look at the questions and the problems that are many and try to solve and answer all of them. But you know who you are and what you can do and what your capacity is. And you answer that one question. And you coalesce with other people who are interested in answering that similar question. So for me, it always begins first and foremost within the context of educating the individual child. And that true education means answering the question, who am I, what am I good at? And then you begin to find others who are in the same lane. And that's where that collective action can happen. But that means that we have to really start thinking about education and not schooling, and challenging schools to truly educate children in an authentic way. I hope that answers that question.
Well, I guess I would say that one of the hallmarks of our society, but also here locally in the past few decades, has been the shrinking of the public sector and the extent to which we've seen privatization of all kinds of public institutions and lessening of support for all those public institutions. And so I would say collective action depends on individuals, but by its nature, it's collective. And so it's going to depend on more than just looking at it at the individual level. And so I think that on some level, it has to build off of our public institutions and enlarge them and build off the capacity that they still have. And in that sense, I think it's especially appropriate that this event is taking place in a public library. Mm-hmm. And I think that public libraries here in Ohio are one of the few institutions that, despite all the cutbacks that they've suffered, continues to get the kind of support at the state level that is untrue of almost any other state in the country. Mm-hmm. And that's the reason why we have the kind of public libraries that we do here in Cleveland, but also across the state. And so we can make use of that institution and others like it, but I think it's a particularly valuable example of how if we invest in our public institutions, they will get support that, in fact, we see too often people are trashing public institutions and saying they don't perform. They don't perform often because they're not given the resources to perform, like the post office. But with our public libraries, they really have, and I think it's evidenced also by the fact that when was the last time that we voted down a public library levy? Here or almost anywhere around the state, they're supported almost universally because people understand what they can do for you. And I think that if we can build that idea of what public institutions can accomplish, they can be the place where much of this activity can be supported and take place.
Excellent, thank you. So I know that we're running out of time. I would love to continue this conversation, and I have a feeling some of us will continue this conversation outside of here. But I'm going to give you one last opportunity. So my final question will actually be, what's next for you? What do you want to leave with? What are you leaving the space with? What do you want to leave the audience with? What do you want to leave the people who will view this later with as the direction that we can go in and how you're going to participate in that? And that's a lot, I know.
It's a great question.
is that the huge things that we want to do is no more false input requests. That's what I like to call those. You get a lot of people together in a room and say, what do you want? Even though we're already doing what we want. So no more false input requests, true, authentic relationship building. Really getting to know somebody, getting to meet people where they are, not bringing them to where you are. Truly being involved, completely turning upside down, dismantling, tearing down what already is happening because it's not working. It's not working for the majority of Clevelanders. So we need something totally different. It's not just a shift. It's not just a change in thinking. It is a complete turning it upside down on its head and doing something totally different. And in order to do that, it will take collective action. So if I'm missing anything, just let me know. But that's what I'm hearing from this group. And so then I just want to know, what are you leaving with today? And how are we going to take this out?
Well, I think that, I try to encourage people, again, especially women, to prioritize self-restoration. I think that women carry a lot. And not only do they carry their own experiences, they carry the experiences of those that came before them. And there are lots of people that will say that trauma is almost genetic. And so we carry it in our very genes and in our blood, what we live with, what we experience. And so you cannot be part of collective action or revolution or any sort of change when you're tired, when you feel absolutely, utterly defeated and exhausted. And so I think that for anyone involved in a movement, whatever that movement might be, you have to make time for self. That is the only way, it's like they say on the airplane, put your life mask on before you go save somebody else. That's what you have to do. And so I think that we have to contemplate, it's kind of like this as Daniel said, this interrogation of self. Like, what am I doing to keep myself sane and together? And if that means, taking a nap, running, eating, whatever it is that you do to take care of self, that is the only way you're going to be able to help other people in your community. So I encourage everyone to think about that. There's always time for you, always. Otherwise, you will never be the champion that we need you to be in this community.
Well, I would suggest that people question what they're being told. And I think one could probably go on at great length about that, but I'll leave it at that.
I guess I would just ask a question. I think when I heard that RNC was coming to Cleveland, because I feel the way I do about the world we live in, it felt like, oh my God, this is no doubt this is going to be a tremendously disempowering experience for myself, my community, and the city of Cleveland. And then over the past year, I've ended up in this amazing situation of just meeting so many powerful people in this city and feeling like we can leverage this moment to help continue creating the world we're looking for. And so I say, what would it look like if we called democracy at its bluff right now? It's a little thought experiment for everyone in this room. And what can we do in this week to leverage this moment towards our power? That's what I'm excited about right now, because I think this discussion is pushing that direction.
I would say our job, my job, everybody else's job, is to create realities that you would want to see, not just in your daily life, but out there in the world. I think people can get really creative when you have little resources, like your mom making a meal out of nothing, like you left in the refrigerator, your mom make a meal. Just feeling like your creations matter in the first place also. So I would say, feel like you matter and create what you would like to see.
That's so great that you said that, Sage. That just reminds me of the time when we were reading Alice Walker, and we were, in our class, we were reading In Search of My Mother's Gardens, and just really tending to the gardens that are in your backyard and recognizing the art and the artistry in everyday magic and making everyday magic. And so I want to piggyback off what you just said and what you just inspired in me. I just want to tend to our gardens. I want to tend to the seeds, tend to our youth, I want to question them, challenge them. I want to ask them the world that they want, the world that they see. I want to ask them what they think is wrong. I want to authentically hear what they think is wrong. I want to hear what they think is right. I want to continue to inspire them to use their voice, to find who and what they are. I want to challenge our schooling institutions to authentically do the same, to not give them another test, and to give them a better test when it authentically asks them who and what they are and what they want to see. I want to challenge institutions to do that. I want to challenge our children to challenge institutions. That's what I'm doing. I think Sage is doing that. I think a number of young people that when given the chance and when given the opportunity and when asked and when we authentically hear them, they will tell you what this world should look like and what this city should look like, and they will help change institutions. And I think that's what that's about. That's my work, and I challenge you to do the same, to listen and to see the youth and to see the young people and the children, even in the adults. To remember that we were all children at one point in time, and to see the youth and the divinity in each and every one of us. That's the challenge.
And the series will continue tomorrow at noon with a discussion about what women really want from their candidates.